afternoon, so thank you to everyone who's joining this. Before we start, just please, everyone from NYMTC staff, please raise your hands. So just to be clear, the emergency exits are highlighted on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. The symbols are marked. If there's an emergency, NYMTC staff will help us evacuate the building. They'll look for those people and they'll make sure that we get out safely. So thank you for joining this meeting. This is part of NYMTC's Regional Trend Series. And through this series, it provides the public with information on current trends and how developments are shaping our regional transportation system. Today, Iana Wagner, an associate transportation planner with the Westchester County Department of Public Works and Transportation, will discuss their B-line bus operation study of the 242nd Street to Getty Square corridor. Now, to talk about Iana joined Westchester County in 2016. She has been involved in multiple transit planning studies, including the Route 7 and Route 13 Mobility Study Operations Analysis, the First and Last Mile Connection Study, the Strategic Transit Route Performance Study, and she is the project lead for the Bronx to Getty Square Study, which will be discussed today. This corridor is one of the busiest corridors in Westchester County. It is served by B-line bus routes 1, 2, 3, provides nearly 300 trips each weekday, and serves 17,000 passengers each weekday. Iana and her team closely examined the corridor's existing conditions, including service characteristics, ridership trends, and other performance measures related to passenger wait times, on-time performance, and service reliability. Through data analysis, field consultation, field work, and public consultation, the team identified improvements that will improve the B-line passenger experience. Opportunities for questions will be available following the presentation. For those online, please type questions into the message board, and we'll respond during the question and answer portion of the presentation. Please welcome Iana Wagner to NYMTC.
Good afternoon, everybody. Working okay? You hear me? Okay. So as Stacey mentioned, my name is Iana Wagner, and I am working with the Department of Public Works and Transportation of Westchester County. And before we get into the study, just wanted to make sure everybody's familiar with the area that we're talking about. Westchester is just north of the Bronx, and we have a population of just under 1 million people. We cover 450 square miles. Our B-line bus system serves the area with approximately 66 routes, mostly concentrated in the southern section over here, but we do expand throughout northern Westchester County as well. We have a fleet size of 325 buses, 3,300 bus stops, and about 323 shelters. Our annual passengers come to 27.2 million, and our average weekday ridership is about 100,000 people a day. So today we're going to look at this corridor just there at the bottom, and zoomed in. We can see that it starts at 242nd Street in the Bronx, where the one subway terminates, and continues on up to Getty Square, which is in downtown Yonkers. It is the central business district of the area, as well as the transit hub. It's a 3.2-mile segment and the bus currently has about 22 stops in each direction, and it takes about 20 minutes, but depends on time and different congestion variations. We chose this corridor mainly because of, as Stacey mentioned, it is one of the most heavily used corridors. We have currently 3 routes operating on it, the 1, 2, and the 3, which see just a little under 300 trips a day, and a total of 17,000 riders using all the routes throughout the whole branch, but 11,000 are getting on and off within this section itself. It also ties to the long-range regional transportation plan, the RTP 2045, which identified Yonkers as a sustainable development center and Route 9 as a sustainable development corridor. And the B-line system in general has a significant regional connection where every subway is met with a B-line bus, And it is a significant transfer point with New York City Transit subway. We see that there's approximately 25% transfers, 5% of which is with bus and 20% is with subways. In 2016, we also had a passenger survey that identified the main trip origins and destinations. You can see that Bronx and Yonkers are the two highest origin destination points, and so this is a really significant section of our Beeline system. And just to give a little background about each of the routes, the one is actually separated into 5 branch patterns, where there's the one, that's a short one, that goes, that's a local to the Yonkers-Hastings border. There's the 1C, which is a local to Westchester Community College and the Medical Center, the 1T to Terrytown, the W to White Plains, and then there's a 1S, which is express to Westchester Community College and the Medical Center as well. And so the section that we're looking at, hold on, is the pointer working? Is really just this main area here where they all overlap. The 2 also runs, but continues on to Tudor Woods and Executive Park, and the Route 3 continues on to Purchase as an express route only during the peak direction, which is northbound AM and the southbound PM for that route. I just wanted to zoom in a little bit into the Getty Square area, just to give an idea of what Getty Square is about and how busy it is in terms of all the number of routes that converge there. And it could be a little confusing when you're there and knowing and understanding which buses stop where and in what direction they're going. Basically, the Route 1, even though there's 5 different branches, only 4 of the branches stop in the same place, while the 1X stops and has a different path. And the Route 2 goes in one direction, in the northbound direction continues this, but because of the one-way streets, does something completely different, where it does this bow tie loop around. And similarly, the 1X does that, but on the southbound direction, it continues down a completely different path. And there is minimal wayfinding, and that led us to believe that there needs to be some improvement in terms of the passengers understanding where each of the buses stop. So to start out the project, we just wanted to go and observe some of the existing conditions, and we noticed that in the Bronx, at 242nd Street, there were very long lines waiting for the buses, and usually they formed in just one single path, one single line, where no matter what bus you were waiting for, you still ended up in one long line that kind of almost went on for like 2 blocks or so. And then there were some people, though, that would stand off to the side, thinking that if their bus would come, they'd be able to get to the front. And when the buses did come, there would be this like weaving pattern where people would bump into each other trying to run to get on the bus. So there's just a lot of chaos that was going on as the buses were arriving. We noticed also that in the southbound direction, buses were overcrowded in the AM coming into 242nd. And passengers were confused about where they needed to stand and what routes go where. We noticed that it was also pretty slow to board all the passengers one at a time onto the bus. And similarly, in Getty Square, there was just a lot of confusion about which buses take what paths and where best they can stand. And the congestion in Getty Square also added to the delays of the buses. We also wanted to talk to some of the passengers waiting in line and get a sense of if they were waiting for any bus that came or if they were waiting for a specific route, and that would give us an idea about if their final destination was Getty Square, before Getty Square, or after Getty Square. So we found out that close to 60% of those people waiting at 242nd Street were waiting really for any bus to come, which means that they're really just getting off either before Getty Square or in Getty Square. And then only 40% were waiting a specific route, which likely is the reason that because they're getting off after Getty Square. In terms of the breakdown of the routes, we found out that the 2 had the highest percentage, which was 13%, and the 1T was next at 8%, and the 1X was at 6%. And then we also surveyed the people at Getty Square, which we had to do at the multiple stops because it's not just one stop for all the routes. And we found that similar to the opposite direction, 40% were getting off before 42nd Street, and 60% had their final destination at 242nd. And we wanted to understand if people were, when they chose what stop to wait for in the Getty Square area, if they understood that while some stops have only one route stopping there, did they understand that there is actually another stop that had all routes stopping there, and that would have increased their frequency. So when we saw people standing at the different bus stops, we wanted to try to understand why wouldn't they wait at the stop that had all three routes going there. And we actually found out A and B, basically, when you add A and B, about 55%, they actually wasn't aware of the stop for one reason or another. So it just highlighted the point that people are really confused about what's going on. So after seeing these preliminary findings, we came up with project goals that we realized we really needed to improve the rider experience. And that we were mainly looking to reduce waiting time at stops, improve the on-time performance, reduce the travel time that you're actually on the bus, and also clarifying the route service. And so we began by looking at a whole bunch of data sets to really understand the existing conditions. So first, we just wanted to know, well, what is the service out there? And so we were able to see throughout the course of the day how the service broke down. And we see that there's 146 total trips on a weekday in the northbound and 141 in the southbound. And then when you look at how it distributes throughout the day, you can see that there's a clear peak between the 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. hour in terms of the number of trips being provided. And in the southbound, there are two smaller peaks that aren't quite as exaggerated in the 7 to 8 a.m. hour, as well as in the 4 to 6 p.m. hour. And what we wanted to do is compare this to the travel demand of the passengers. And when we did that, it was quite interesting because now the bars are the number of people getting on at 242nd, and you can see that actually in the northbound direction, the peak number of people getting on is happening in the PM between the 5 to 7 p.m. hour, and this gray curve over here reflects the service that we just looked at, where the peak was showing the AM hour. And similarly, in the southbound direction, there was a clear defined peak in the morning going in the southbound direction, whereas the service that was being provided had those even two humps, both in the AM and the PM. And so we realized that the service is actually not in alignment with the passenger demand throughout the day. And while there is likely a good reason for that, probably because there's different points of interest and different trends going on north of Getty Square, which the routes are connected to, it does show that there is a need to look at this segment as having different trends than the rest of the segment. And we then also looked at the number of people actually on every single trip over the course of the day, and it does emphasize the same information where in the northbound direction, at about the 4 p.m. hour, the trips are starting to get pretty full with close to 60 passengers on each trip, and this stays pretty crowded throughout the evening. And even though in the previous slide we saw that the number of passengers do go down in the later evenings because the service is also much less, we see that the trips are still crowded. And similarly, in the southbound direction, the morning trips are crowded all the way from the beginning in the 5 a.m. hour all the way through 8 a.m. And so we wanted to delve in a little deeper, and I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but we wanted to really look at each trip by trip, what's happening, how full are the vehicles, and are the right vehicles being assigned to each trip. So here you can see the light blue line is the load of passengers that are on the bus, and the dark blue line is the seated capacity of the vehicle that is being assigned. And I just chose to show here the northbound PM hours, so because we saw that that is what had a higher number of people. And you can see that whenever the light blue line is above the seated capacity, those might be vehicles that we might look to make from the 40-foot vehicles, which seat about 46 passengers. We could increase, if we assign those to articulated, which would seat about 68 passengers, then we would, it would be a better assignment of vehicles. And we can see that in this, it's about the 5 o'clock hour for all these trips, an articulated bus is not being assigned where it is deserving of one. And then there are a handful of trips also that where the articulated buses are being assigned, like you could see here and wherever the point is higher, but the fact that the loads aren't really warranting them. And then another data set that we wanted to understand is just throughout the corridor how the stop activity fluctuates. So just to know, which stops are being used and if there are any that that there's really not that much activity. And we saw that, obviously the 242nd Street has the highest number of use, and then the next few stops in the Bronx really saw very little activity. But once we get into Yonkers, it really did fluctuate, with a lot of pretty highly used stops. And similarly in the southbound direction, we have ups and downs with each stop, but the last few stops in the Bronx, people aren't really getting on or off there. They're really just heading to 242nd Street. Then we also wanted to look into on-time performance, and these graphs over here show the percentage of trips that are either 5 or more minutes late. And so in the northbound direction, and then we took it at 3 stops. One is the first stop, where it starts at 242nd, a midway point at Broadway and McLean, and then at Getty Square. And we see that the northbound direction, really, because it's the beginning of the route, only 5.5% of trips are running more than 5 minutes late. It does increase a bit midway, but then also goes down a little bit. And it tells us that trips are generally on time, and you can also see with the average minutes late, they're really only a couple of minutes late, and that reflects that the buses are getting to the first stop in time, there's enough layover time and enough time from wherever else they're coming, and then it does increase slightly, but not too significantly, and it does get back down to 9.6%. So it's not too much lateness in the northbound direction. But in the southbound direction, mainly because now we're at the end of these longer routes, we are seeing a higher percentage of trips, with 37.1 trips at Getty Square already being late. But by the time it gets midway, it does go down to 21%, and then still similarly to 23.8% at 242nd Street. And so this implies that there may not really be so much delay that's happening specifically on the corridor itself. And it's really that because these branches are tied to longer routes, that is really that they're subject to so much delay that's going on further north. We also did want to, though, delve into, on a trip-by-trip basis, what is happening in terms of this on-time performance, which trips are running late and why. And we realized also that when we're getting the reports of how late they're running, they're comparing the arrival time to the actual arrival time to the scheduled arrival time. So one thing we noticed, if you look at the bottom graph, this is now the southbound in the PM direction, and this dotted line here is the scheduled arrival time. So unrelated to what's happening, just the amount of time that's being allotted for the trips are vary significantly from trip to trip, even ones that are right next to each other. And while you'd expect it to take different times based on travel conditions and peak and rush hour and peak hours, you wouldn't expect this much variation from one trip right to the next. So, you know, if you have a 4:54 p.m. at 15 minutes, and the next one is at 22 minutes within, and it's only within 5 minutes apart from each other. So we noticed that there's actually just too much fluctuation and inconsistency with the travel times itself, and that is contributing to the numbers in terms of the average minutes late. So besides looking at the existing data, we also wanted to reach out to the public and hear their feedback. So when the project first started, we held with various stakeholders, including New York City DOT, New York City Transit, and Department of City Planning, as well as Yonkers. And we held our first public outreach meeting in March 2018, where we introduced the project and received feedback. And we also had an online survey that was up for a couple of weeks prior to that meeting. And the feedback that we heard from the public was they were looking for more frequent service, especially during the late evening and weekend hours. They wanted more articulated buses for crowded trips and improved timing for connecting transfers. And also, they did want further investigation on what's happening north of Getty Square and better customer communication. We also had a second public meeting to present our findings and recommended improvements in November 2018. So combining the data that we collected, our initial observations, as well as the comments we received from the public, we went back to our project goals, and when we were trying to figure out what the improvements to, we wanted to make sure that they lined up both with what the data shows and what our project goals were. So in terms of reducing the waiting time at stops and figuring out how, it was pretty straightforward that to reduce wait time at stops, you can add more service. To reduce the travel time on the buses, we can try to provide a faster trip with fewer stops. To improve reliability and on-time performance, we can either adjust schedule times to better reflect the real conditions and look into the causes of delay and try to reduce those. And then in terms of improving public information, just providing clearer signage and wayfinding. And just to give a little project about the timeline that we've been talking about, our study began in April 2017, where we started to analyze the conditions. We had our first public meeting in March, at which point we started to develop alternatives, and we had a second public meeting in November of 2018. And when we started developing the alternatives, we realized that there's a handful of things that we knew we can do right away. There was a long line. People were frustrated from the confusion and from the crowded buses. And even though there were medium and longer term improvements that we really wanted to tackle, there's no reason that we couldn't get started on a short-term improvement. So we categorized the improvements that we just went over into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And the short-term, we even started right away in June 2018, and incrementally with every service change, we tried to address some of those short-term improvements of adding more service and adjust the scheduled time. And then looking more to the more complex elements, providing a faster trip and better wayfinding are in the process now, and also then further looking into the longer-term improvements of reducing cause of delay. So while we just want to make clear that while we did start implementing these short-term improvements, we still, because they're so recent, we still have to go back and continuously monitor and modify as needed. So I'm not going to have like the before and after conditions exactly, but we can see certain benefits already. So to get into some of the short-term improvements that we've already implemented, this is just bringing back the graph that we saw, and this was the problem area. And so we were already able to implement 3 new trips on the one in the northbound direction in that PM hour, and essentially reducing the headway for that time from 6 minutes to 5 minutes. And then in the weekday southbound morning time, this morning time where we saw crowded trips, we already did implement an extended trip on Route 2, which stopped at Getty Square, now continues on to 242nd, and another additional trip in the early morning hour. And I didn't show the data here, but we also we're looking into the Saturday and Sunday data, and so this one reflects the Saturday northbound direction, which showed pretty crowded buses from 7 p.m. on, and which was in agreement with also the feedback that we had from the public that they were looking for extended late hour service. So we were able to add some new late evening trips, 7 and 7:55, and then another one, 2, a pretty late 8:55 evening. And then also in the next service change, we also added another 2 late evening trips. And on Sunday, we also noticed the early morning crowded trips, and so we did provide additional trips on both the 1 and the 2. And then just going back to where we saw that fluctuation in the scheduled times, we went and made it a little bit more consistent. So now the scheduled times that it takes from 242nd to Getty Square is closer to the 20 minutes that we see at the peak times. In terms of the medium-term improvement, it takes a little bit more planning due to its complexity. We are looking into having now a nonstop shuttle service so that it is separate. It will only stop at 242nd and Getty Square, and because Broadway is 2 lanes up until the Yonkers border, we would want it to turn on to Riverdale Avenue in order so that it could bypass local buses. And so we're looking to do that in those peak hours. And the main idea behind that would be we'd be getting the shorter running times without stopping. And we think that there would be a potential to save about 5 minutes per trip. And this would separate this segment from the rest of the branches. And it might save operationally. It might mean that the branches can end in Getty Square during the time that they don't need to be getting down to 242nd. And likewise in the other direction, only starting Getty Square, because now a shuttle would be supplementing that service. And it also wouldn't be subject to the delays that the longer branch routes accumulated. However, it would mean that it wouldn't serve any of the intermediate stops and may need to increase transfers for those who do need it. And we're not looking to take away any scheduled trips. This would just be additional, so it shouldn't affect the time for people who did need those stops. But we're still working out and kind of hashing out some of the details on this proposal. And then looking back at the vehicle assignment, where we know that we do have to reassign some of the trips to either be articulated when it's not or take away and articulate it if it's not needed. But it is a little bit more of a larger effort because of how all the buses are interlined with each other, and even though it's not needed right here, it might be coming from a trip where it is needed, or vice versa, it might be needed here, but we don't need to be sending it the rest of its way when it's not needed. So you really need to look at the whole system comprehensively in order to change even just a few trips to be articulated. These were the locations that seem to be in most dire need of the reassignment. Other medium-term improvements is the wayfinding, and some of these are really simple solutions that we need to get on board with. Where right now at the 242nd Street subway station, we can install full-on system maps. Right? There's no indication that the B line even exists there right when you get out of the subway. So kind of bringing more clarification to the terminal itself, as well as the destination signs are currently missing, so it's just an easy fix to put so that people can clearly understand where the branches go. And then just also system-wide, making sure that stops have the full bus system and the schedules that are needed, and as well as in Getty Square itself, having wayfinding signs that can direct people to either different points of interest and the different routes that exist, and making sure that it's clear what buses stop at which stop. And also we're looking into having the real-time information signs in the Getty Square area, and that would help with, you know, showing the real-time information that we do have already available on Google Maps, but just getting it out to the public in a better fashion. And at 242nd Street itself, where we saw those long lines, really having some sort of curbside management of the buses can help the passenger queues. So right now, you know, there's just one stop where all the buses, whatever pulls in forward, pulls up all the way to the front, which might operationally be what a driver would want to do, just so he doesn't have to swerve around any other buses. But in terms of the lines that will be created if we were able to separate out the branches so that there's clear queuing lines for each branch separately, and this way there isn't the back and forth of people running to the buses, that would help just the queuing at that location. And we would have to do some further coordination with New York City Transit and New York City DOT for that. And for other longer-term improvements that we were looking into, these would really be trying to reduce the delays, and which would be the time it takes. One of it would be the time it takes to get on the people on the bus. So having an off-board fare collection, it really seems to be obvious at 242nd Street. It would reduce the dwell time and speed up trips, and this way it would also allow for all-door boarding. And I mean, it is good timing with the adoption of the Omni as well. That's going to be coming also to Westchester in the 2021 and 2022 timeframe. We will be coordinating further with New York City MTA, and this is really an opportunity where we could have all-door boarding if we have those installed on both the front and the back entrances. We also were looking into transit signal priority in the queue jump lane, where it reduces the bus delay because it allows the buses to pass by just general traffic and get ahead of them, and then move forward onto the bus without having to wait behind the cars. And we did identify one location in Getty Square where we think it would be the most beneficial. And it doesn't have to be the transit signal priority. It could just be a queue jump lane. So it's you know, if there is a little more capital that we needed for the signal, the queue jump lane would really just be pavement marking. So it's something that could help because this is actually an intersection that has like a ton of different routes that go through Getty Square. So it wouldn't just be benefiting the 1, 2, and 3 that we see now. It would be benefiting, like, I think maybe 10 or so different bus routes. So our next steps is we still do need to go and monitor the short-term improvements that we've already done and see how the ridership has changed or how crowded the buses are now, and modify it as necessary. We did take an initial look at it, but it's just that because it was so recent, we tried to take the typical data during the October or April months, and just to have enough data recorded. We did see improvement where the ridership is increasing, but from the trips before and after the trips that we provided, from the additional trips that we provided, but it's also attracting new passengers, which is the ideal. And so we still need to have some further refinement and implement the medium and long-term improvements and coordination with Yonkers and MTA in terms of those improvements. So the final report is located at this website, and if anybody has questions. Yes?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So you noted that one of the reasons this was funded through, federally through NYMTC was because of the Sustainable Development Center that is Getty Square. There's significant new commercial development happening now, coming online now in Getty Square. Did you look at any projections of perhaps increased demand going into the future?
So I think when we started this, it was already a couple of years ago, but as time moves forward, we're always looking at the demand. So, it's not, as we saw, the improvement of increasing frequency is on the easier end of improvement. So, having that, because it's a short-term improvement, as time goes on and we see the need, I think we can address those as they come, instead of predicting it and not seeing exactly when the demand is. So we kind of want to see it first, and then we'll respond to it. But it could happen pretty quickly once it does happen.
Hi, this was excellent. I give you a lot of credit for, those charts, if you were able to do that technologically. Wow. I'm relying on a 66-year-old memory of Broadway, but I was thinking, if it's 2 lanes and it ultimately goes down to 1, is there a possibility for during the peak to do something where, if I recall, there's parking a lot on both sides of Broadway. So during the peak, you would have southbound not have parking on one side during certain hours, to have a dedicated bus lane along with preemption. And the reason I ask that is, I live in Chatham, New Jersey, and what we did there's a new startup company called boxcarapp.com, and what they do is they find parking for people who are looking to park the car for the day, et cetera. So they actually work with residents, with driveways, with stores and parking lots, with churches that have lots that are not used during the day, and it's allowed us to put in bike lanes. And I actually lease out 2 spots, so.
Well, actually, there was a project that did just go in while also this project was occurring, that they did put in dual bike lanes on the east side by the park. And so it did narrow the parking lane, and it did bring out the bus islands. So there was an improvement. In terms of reducing a lane for the bus, we actually didn't really see that there was so much delay because of the traffic congestion in the end, even though it was something we saw from the get-go that there would be. It wasn't, when we looked at the on-time performance, there wasn't that much of there wasn't delay between the travel just for the segment of that travel time. The delay was happening by the time it already got to Getty Square. So it just didn't seem that it warranted taking away the travel lane, especially when just at the peak there's 6-minute headways and then less on non-peaks. And so we just didn't think it would be warranted. And
This was excellent, and as the gentleman said, all those charts and graphs and tables, kudos to you. And one thing is, data-driven decisions is really, really important for this, and sometimes data really serves to reinforce things that you already suspect, and other times they surprise you. Was there a particular aha moment that you had?
Yeah, I think there were a couple. One is that, well, first we didn't think there would be such a misalignment in the demand between what was being provided and then the passenger demand. We thought it must be that there's more trips at this peak hour because the demand is there, but it could be, these schedules and routes have been there for many years. You know, trends change, things could have been different. And we only got the APC, the automatic passenger count machines on the buses a few years ago, in 2013, I believe. We didn't have as much information as we do have now, and so, but we're kind of catching up with now looking at all the data and seeing that just because something exists doesn't mean that it still needs to exist in that way. So that was probably one of the ones, and then the other one is we actually saw a bigger majority were going to be just 242nd to Getty Square, and looking at the surveys and also then the activity at the intermediate stops, we found that a bigger portion than what we thought, where it was 40% of people waiting for a specific branch, and then also just that there was so much on and off at the intermediary stops that we started thinking that it's an obvious thing to have this like express direct nonstop, but I think it's less obvious than because on the numbers so many people are using those intermediary stops, which we thought this would replace some of the schedules, but now we realize that we don't want people waiting too long for those intermediary stops, so we're looking at having it just a handful of trips additional.
Yes, excellent analysis. I'm always amazed at how different transit can be, from what you think it's going to be when you actually dive into a deep analysis. And I guess a couple of questions. One is does the MTA provide service on the southern end of the corridor? Is that one of the reasons maybe why the stop numbers are lower? And also, did you consider BRT as a long-term option in the corridor?
So the MTA does provide the BX9, but that only goes to the Yonkers border, and then there is an express bus, I want to say the BXN3, that goes actually to Getty Square, but doesn't stop at 242nd, so people have to be coming from further down to be going to Getty Square. And so with the BRT, we're kind of looking at like isolated elements of the all-door boarding and off-board fare collection, but the queue jump lane, but in terms of having the separated lane, with it being one lane north of the border, it really didn't justify it, and also, we wouldn't be able to. It's not our municipality. Like once it's in the Bronx, and then in Yonkers it didn't. We only had the one lane, so we didn't look into the lane. But in isolated elements, we're trying to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I had another question. I was intrigued by the fare collection, to speed that up. Have you thought, how would you handle a lot of the working poor and elderly who don't have smartphones and that type of thing?
Right, that's a big concern, and that's why we're going to be working closely with the MTA to making sure that, however they're thinking through it, we're going to adopt those same things. I mean, the elderly is a huge portion of our ridership as well, and it'll be one of our, right, so it'll definitely be one of our, things that we're going to make sure needs to keep going.
So the number one route is probably one of the most complicated routes in the region, maybe the country, and it's evolved over time with all those branches, but what your analysis is showing is that the trunk is really important. So has there been any consideration given to pruning the branches?
Yes, and I think out of this analysis came more questions, and because we had to limit its scope to the corridor, and I think that it does warrant, the rest of the branch line warrants for sure further analysis similar to this, but understanding how all the branches work. But saying that we are also going to be taking a full network look at a redesign, so I think all those questions are going to be coming to play about how can we work with the branches and the route structure.
Okay, actually, before we go to this gentleman, we have one from our participants online.
One question is, how will those added trips and schedule changes be communicated to commuters?
So with every service change, we post the changes both on our website and on the buses themselves as well. There's usually like a summary of the extra services that are being provided, and the schedules will be edited, or the ones that have already been implemented are already in place. So it's just the extra services that are present on the schedules themselves.
Yes, I've been right here in Nintex. I think your study makes, to be something very informative and, very interesting approaches. Now, what I want to ask you, as it relates to, and even before I say that, the link between West 242nd Street and Getty Square is a very vital corridor. But from a sub-regional context in terms of Yonkers, Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, and the Northeast Bronx on the other side of the Bronx, have you guys kind of thought about transportation in the region, the sub-region as a whole, in terms of how that feeds into Getty Square and the developments that's taking place there, especially on the Yonkers waterfront and so forth?
Right. So, we're always looking at, the areas that do need improvement. So, with any new development, I think that as we see that that development is bringing passengers, bringing ridership, we would be accommodating to the needs there.
I had a question about where at 242nd Street, where you have the long lines forming. Were you able to determine what might be the average waiting time for people, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes? And the reason I ask is I noticed, and maybe I missed it, but it didn't seem like there was any cover. So you get a day like today, you're standing in the rain for 5 or 10 minutes.
No, absolutely. So it all depends on the subways that come in, because it's pretty much like 100% of the line is coming from the subway. So the number of trips coming in is a bit more than the number of trips we have, and it all depends on, and even though there's a schedule of subways, it's not exactly, so it's not like we can exactly match our departure times to those subways, but during the peak hours with 5-minute headways, or between 5 and 6 minute headways, it shouldn't be, the wait times shouldn't be too long for if you're going to Getty Square. Once you take that away and you're looking for a specific branch, then they do come, especially at certain times, they come less frequently. And so those headways could be, it's a little hard to meet that demand because there's not as many people needing the branch lines. And in terms of shelters, I think we would love to see shelters there, and I think we can continue working with New York City and transit. Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other questions from our participants?
No, there are no online questions. Oh, wait, there's one more. So, would you have TPS in both the Bronx and Westchester? Would you see the same technology in both places? Also, would you use queue jump lanes in both places?
I think for this area right now, we see the benefit really at the Getty Square location because of because there's so many more buses actually there. Besides the 3 that we were looking into, there's at least 15 or so using those other stops. So I think that would be where we would tackle it first. But of course, if we could work to get it further south, it would have to be compatible with the same technology. So that's why it's a longer term improvement that we need to still work out.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Any additional questions?
In that case, I would like to thank Alana. Thank you again for coming down. This is a great presentation. the exemplary work that the member agencies do, funded through the Unified Planning Work Program, the NYMTC planning process, but it shows that they do really great work that informs the decision-making process at their agencies and recommends improvements that are, as you noted, quickly implemented. And then, of course, you've also developed medium and long-term proposals that should very much improve the B-line service in that corridor. So thank you again for that work, and thanks to all the member agencies who do exemplary work through this program. If there are no further questions, just as a quick plug, we are planning a transportation demand management ground bag. It is tentatively scheduled for July 24th, but please be on the lookout for the public notice for that event. Otherwise, thank you for coming.